Hi, this is Matt Baker. Earlier this year, I made this timeline of Canadian political parties based on the style of this really old timeline of US political parties. Well, people seem to really like the format because I got a lot of requests for more charts like this, but for other countries. So I decided to make a timeline of United Kingdom political parties. As you can probably guess, this one ended up being much more complicated than the Canadian one, but I managed to do it, and in today's video, I'm going to explain it to you in detail. I'm also happy to announce that I'm making this UK one available as a limited edition poster. So if you want to get a copy, just head over to usefulcharts.com by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. Okay, before we look at the chart, let me back up a bit and set the stage for you. During the 1600s, the area now known as the UK existed as three separate kingdoms: England, Scotland, and Ireland, even though all three shared the same monarch. In 1642, there was a civil war in England over who should be the ultimate authority, the king or the parliament. Those who supported the king became known as Cavaliers, and those who supported Parliament became known as Roundheads. In the end, the Roundheads won, and after a brief period with no monarch at all, followed by some conflict over which branch of the royal family should sit on the throne, both England and Scotland finally became constitutional monarchies in 1689. Shortly thereafter, in 1707, England and Scotland officially merged to become Great Britain, and then in 1801, Ireland was added as well, resulting in the creation of the United Kingdom. So, as you can see, the chart starts with the establishment of the UK in 1801. However, because the Parliament of Great Britain simply became the Parliament of the UK with a few extra Irish seats, there were already two major political factions in place: the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories were more right-leaning and traced their origins back to the Cavaliers, whereas the Whigs were more left-leaning and traced their origins back to the Roundheads. There was also already a prime minister, William Pitt the Younger. On December 31st, 1800, he went to bed as the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and on January 1st, 1801, he woke up as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. However, he did not stay Prime Minister of the UK for long. This is because he wanted to give Catholics the right to vote, but the king did not. Pitt therefore resigned and was replaced by Henry Addington. Okay, let me now point out a few important things about how this chart works. The first thing is that the ruling party is always shown on top. So it was the Tories, the party of both Pitt and Addington, that first held power, with the Whigs being what's called the opposition. Secondly, every time you see a year indicated, like this, that represents an election year. So the first UK election was held in 1802, with the Tories, now led by Henry Addington, holding on to power, although take note that Addington eventually resigned, resulting in Pitt the Younger taking over once again. Finally, whenever you see a shaded area, such as right here, just prior to 1807, that indicates a minority government. Basically, whenever one party holds more than 50% of the seats in Parliament, that's called a majority government. But in situations where no party has above 50%, that's called a minority government. What this usually means is that the party with the most seats still gets to rule, but they have to do so by working with other parties or individuals. This happened for the first time in the UK shortly after Pitt the Younger died. You see, at this point, a few Tories wanted to work with the Whigs and form a coalition due to the Napoleonic Wars, whereas other Tories did not. In the 1806 election, the coalition Tories won, but after just 1 year, the coalition started to fall apart, putting the government in a minority position. Thus, there was another election in 1807, this time with the non-coalition Tories winning a majority. From here, the Tories went on to hold a majority for over 20 years, through 4 more elections and several prime ministers, including Spencer Perceval, the only British prime minister to ever be assassinated, and Lord Liverpool, the longest-serving UK prime minister to date. Although take note that Robert Walpole and Pitt the Younger both served longer, but as prime ministers of Great Britain, not the UK. All right, it was with the retirement of Lord Liverpool that the political landscape in the UK started to change. By this point, the Tories were split between moderate Tories and a group known as the Ultra-Tories. With the help of some Whigs, the moderates were initially able to hold on to power, but eventually, in 1831, the Tories lost, and the Whigs were finally able to come to power on their own. The new Whig Prime Minister was Earl Grey. He's mostly remembered today for his association with Earl Grey tea, even though there's no firm evidence of a link between him and the initial popularity of the tea. What he should be remembered for is the Great Reform Act of 1832, which gave more people the right to vote. This led to the creation of additional factions in Parliament, the 2 most notable ones being the Irish Repeal Movement, which wanted to repeal the Acts of Union so that Ireland could once again be governed separately, and the Radicals, who wanted even more electoral change. It also led to the rebranding of the Tories as the Conservatives, as it became clear that the Tories were not going to survive unless they were willing to support at least some reform. Pretty soon, the Whigs also found it difficult to survive in the new political landscape. In 1837, they had to make an agreement with the Radicals and Irish Repeal in order to stay in power, an agreement known as the Lichfield House Compact. This was the first step in the Whigs' eventual transformation into the Liberal Party. The second step occurred when the Conservatives split over the issue of free trade. Those who supported free trade were known as the Peelites, named after Robert Peel, and they eventually ended up forming a coalition government with the Whigs. Around the same time, the Irish Repeal movement was replaced with the Independent Irish Party. As you can see, this entire period was quite chaotic, with the Parliament being in a minority position most of the time. Things finally changed in 1859 with the creation of the Liberal Party. Basically, the Whigs, Peelites, Irish Party, and Radicals all joined together under the Liberal banner. The result was that the UK was back to 2 main parties. Instead of the Tories and the Whigs, it was now the Conservatives and the Liberals. Over the next 3 decades, power went back and forth between these 2 parties, with the 2 main leaders being William Gladstone for the Liberals and Benjamin Disraeli for the Conservatives. During this period, a new movement advocating for Irish Home Rule also rose up, which eventually evolved into the Irish Parliamentary Party, or IPP. By 1885, Gladstone and most of his fellow Liberals were supportive of Irish Home Rule, but some Liberals were not. These Liberals became known as Liberal Unionists, and they eventually became more closely aligned with the Conservatives, now led by Lord Salisbury. In fact, they formed a coalition with them in 1895. Now, it's very important to keep in mind that whenever you hear the word unionist in the context of British politics, it does not have anything to do with labor unions. Rather, instead, it refers to those who support Ireland, or later Northern Ireland, remaining in union with Great Britain. Take note that eventually the Liberal Unionists ended up merging with the Conservatives. Because of this, the Conservatives actually changed their name to the Conservative and Unionist Party. And that's actually been their official party name ever since, all the way up to today, even though most people just call them the Conservatives. Okay, in the year 1900, we get the birth of the Labour Representation Committee, which soon thereafter became known as the Labour Party. As you probably know, it would eventually eclipse the Liberal Party as the main party on the left, but that process didn't happen overnight. So let me show you how it did happen. First of all, there was World War I, which began with the Liberals in power under Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith. he eventually formed a wartime coalition with the support of both the Conservatives and Labour. But after about a year, Asquith was forced to resign and was replaced by David Lloyd George. Although George was a Liberal, most other Liberals left the coalition at this point, meaning that it was now made up mostly of Conservatives and Labour. Meanwhile, a revolution was growing in Ireland, with most people no longer wanting just home rule, but full independence. Those who supported the revolution joined together under the banner of Sinn Féin, which in Irish means we ourselves. In 1918, just after the end of World War I, an election was held with David George Lloyd's coalition winning easily. However, when it came to the seats from Ireland, Sinn Féin won in a landslide, but instead of sitting in the UK Parliament, they formed their own parliament and declared independence, meaning that Ireland and the UK were now at war. The Irish War of Independence lasted until 1921, when a treaty was signed recognizing the creation of the Irish Free State, which consisted of most of the island, except for a small part in the north. Thus, in 1922, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was renamed the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The first election without most of Ireland was held that year. A few months earlier, the wartime coalition was disbanded, and thus the Conservatives ended up winning a majority. However, the new Prime Minister, Bonar Law, was shortly thereafter diagnosed with terminal cancer and had to resign. In 1923, his replacement, Stanley Baldwin, called an election, but this time the Conservatives were only able to achieve a small minority. Within less than a year, they lost a vote of confidence, and therefore the Labour Party was invited to form government for the very first time under Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. But they had to rely on a special pact with the Liberals. But eventually, they too lost a vote of confidence within less than a year. And thus, in 1924, yet another election was called. 4 days before that election, a letter surfaced, claiming to be from Grigory Zinoviev, the head of Communist International, calling for a Bolshevik-style revolution in the UK. This caused many people to shy away from voting for Labour, thus allowing the Conservatives to win in a landslide, regaining back their majority. Nowadays, the letter is thought to have been a forgery, but what was done was done. During the 1920s, yet another left-wing party grew in popularity, known as the Cooperative Party. In 1927, they entered into an agreement with Labour that stands to this day. Basically, in any given constituency, there will only ever be a Labour candidate or a co-op candidate. And winning co-op candidates are generally included in Labour totals. So, for example, there are currently 403 Labour MPs in the UK Parliament. Of these 403, 41 are actually co-op MPs. Anyhow, Ramsay MacDonald and the Labour Party came back to power in 1929, but once again with a minority, only held together because of another Lib-Lab pact. I should also note that this was the first election in which women were granted the right to vote at the same age as men. Now, if you know your history, you'll know that the 1930s brought the Great Depression. Well, this really shook up British politics. First of all, there was a major split in the Liberal Party, with the Liberal Nationals, later known as the National Liberals, developing closer ties with the Conservatives. But more importantly, because the economy was doing so poorly, MacDonald agreed to form a coalition government. This led to the Labour Party kicking out their own leader, as well as some of his supporters, and refusing to join the coalition. Thus, after the 1931 election, the UK found itself in a very unusual position. The Prime Minister was still Ramsay MacDonald, the former Labour leader, but most of those in his coalition were actually Conservatives. I should also point out that there was still an Irish party, although it was now limited to Northern Ireland. It consisted of the remnants of the old IPP, but they now used the name Nationalist Party. This party lasted until the 1950s, when it basically fizzled out. But back to the 1930s, MacDonald eventually declined in health and was replaced by former Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Then, after Baldwin retired, Neville Chamberlain took the lead. Chamberlain is mostly remembered today for his attempt to appease Hitler and thus avoid World War II. But World War II came anyway, and pretty soon it became clear that Chamberlain was not the right man for the job. He was thus replaced by Winston Churchill, and at this point the Labour Party joined the coalition government as well. Churchill, of course, led the UK to victory, but despite this, in the 1945 election, he lost, and instead the Labour Party won their first majority ever, with their leader Clement Attlee becoming Prime Minister. He is generally regarded as one of the greatest UK Prime Ministers of all time. This is because he established a lot of great social programs, including the NHS, which is the UK's universal healthcare program. After the war, the Liberal Nationals merged with the Conservatives, leaving the remaining Liberals as a much smaller party, never again to finish first or second. Thus, from the end of the war to today, it's been Labour and the Conservatives as the two main parties. I now want to jump ahead to the 1970s, because that's when the political landscape underwent its next major change. That decade saw a bunch of new smaller parties winning seats for the first time, such as the SNP, or Scottish National Party, which promotes independence for Scotland, and the Plaid Cymru, which promotes independence for Wales. Also winning seats for the first time was the SDLP, or Social Democratic and Labour Party, which wants Northern Ireland to reunite with Ireland. It's allied with the main Labour Party and is basically the successor of the old IPP. However, ever since the 1970s, there have been several other Irish parties as well. Initially, the largest Irish party was the UUP, or Ulster Unionist Party. Previously, it had been allied with the Conservatives, but ever since 1972, its MPs have sat on their own. Around the same time, the DUP, or Democratic Unionist Party, won its first seat. And then eventually, Sinn Féin won a seat as well, although they have a policy of not actually sitting in the UK Parliament. So, over the last 50 years, there's basically been four main parties competing for seats in Northern Ireland. The UUP and DUP are both right-leaning, but also unionist, in that they want Northern Ireland to remain a part of the UK. The main difference is that the DUP is more hardline and the UUP is more moderate. Likewise, the SDLP and Sinn Féin are both left-leaning, but also nationalist, in that they want Irish reunification. Again, the main difference is that Sinn Féin is more hardline and the SDLP is more moderate. But let me now return to the Great Britain parties. First, I'll point out the Lib-Lab Pact of 1977, the third and most recent time that the Liberals agreed to support Labour during a minority. Second, in 1981, a group actually split off from Labour, known as the SDP, or Social Democratic Party. They formed an alliance with the Liberals, and then eventually merged with them, at which point the Liberals were renamed as the Liberal Democrats, or Lib Dems for short. Ever since then, the Liberal Democrats have generally done a bit better. Let me now give you a quick overview of the last 40 years. The 1980s were the peak of the Thatcher years, Margaret Thatcher being the UK's first female Prime Minister. She moved the country in a more conservative direction than any other conservative leader since pre-war times. She also served for almost 12 straight years. That's longer than anyone else on this chart, except for Lord Liverpool, way back near the beginning. She was followed by John Major, who extended the Conservatives' hold on power to 18 straight years. But then in 1997, Labour finally came back to power under Tony Blair. In order to win, he used the term New Labour and shifted the party away from its socialist roots and more towards free market capitalism. You see, prior to Blair, the Conservatives were on the right Labour was on the left, and the Lib Dems were in the center, although leaning left. However, during the Blair years, as well as those of his successor, Gordon Brown, Labour basically switched places with the Lib Dems. And ever since then, it's kind of gone back and forth, although I'd say that the Lib Dems have moved back towards the center. Labour stayed in power until 2010, when they were defeated by David Cameron's Conservatives. However, the Conservatives did not win enough seats for a majority that year, and therefore they ended up having to form a coalition with the Lib Dems. This lasted until the next election in 2015, when they were able to win a majority. However, several other interesting things happened that year. First of all, the Lib Dems fell to 4th place for the first time ever, with the SNP surpassing them and taking 3rd place. You see, just 1 year prior to this, there had been a referendum on Scottish independence, with the pro-independence side managing to get 45% of the vote. Of course, that wasn't quite enough, so Scotland did not become independent. Since then, there has been talk of a second referendum, but that has not yet happened, and the SNP's popularity has since declined. The other thing that happened that year was that UKIP, or the UK Independence Party, won its first seat during a general election, that of its leader, Nigel Farage. They wanted the UK to leave the European Union, and although they won only a single seat, they received 13% of the popular vote, and were thus able to push the issue of Brexit to the forefront. A national referendum on Brexit occurred the following year, and to many people's surprise, the Leave side won, with almost 52% of the vote. This led to David Cameron resigning, and Theresa May becoming the Prime Minister. In the hopes of increasing her majority, Theresa May called an election in 2017, but her plan backfired. The Conservatives ended up with a minority and had to make a deal with the Irish DUP in order to hold on to power. She tried several times to negotiate a Brexit deal, one that the majority of the parliament could be happy with. But in the end, she was unable to do so and was forced to resign. She was replaced by Boris Johnson, who in 2019 was able to win a majority, and in 2020 was able to finally make Brexit happen. But Johnson's tenure was riddled with scandals, including Partygate, in which he broke COVID safety regulations and then lied about it. In the summer of 2022, he was forced to resign and was replaced by Liz Truss. But Liz Truss, well, she served for only 49 days, which is the shortest of any British Prime Minister to date. In October of 2022, she became the 4th Conservative Prime Minister in a row to resign and was replaced by Rishi Sunak, who remained in place until the 2024 election. That election, held just last year, saw Labour coming back to power for the first time in 14 years. So, currently, the Prime Minister of the UK is Labour leader Keir Starmer. A few other things to note about the current UK Parliament. The Lib Dems are now back in a solid 3rd place, and there's also some new, smaller parties on the scene. There's the Reform Party, which is basically the successor of UKIP, as well as the Green Party. Okay, so that was a look at the timeline of UK political parties. Once again, this chart is available as a poster for a limited time only. So if you want to get a copy, head over to usefulcharts.com right now, or click the link in the description or pinned comment. Thanks for watching.